start, huh? You think so?
Sure.
You have to
I
unmute
unmuted
yourself.
myself.
All right, okay. I'll start then.
So welcome everyone to another episode of the Tea House that we do here on Thursday nights from our basement. We're really happy to have you all. We're especially happy to have Mark Jolly here with us tonight, and I'm going to tell you about Mark in a minute. But you know, first I wanted to just highlight a few things. Something I haven't done very well in the past when we've done these presentations is sort of highlight some of the other things that we have going on the Sifter of Dust website. You know, we've partnered with the Baha'i family, who put together this marvelous presentation series called Modern Perspectives. And they have their own YouTube channel, and it's terrific. But you can also link to it through Sifter of Dust. You know, tonight we really are excited because we were able to ask our friend Mark Jolly to come in and give a presentation. You know, we've known Mark for several years. He lives in the Philadelphia area, but you'll be able to tell from his accent he's not a native Philadelphian. But he and his lovely wife do a wonderful job with a YouTube channel, really, called True Food TV. It is YouTube's most watched channel dedicated to the origin stories of food. And Mark's a filmmaker and a journalist. I've watched several of his videos. They're just fabulous, beautifully done about the organic production of food. And maybe Mark will tell us a little bit more about it when we get him on. He's also had a storied career. He's a longtime contributor to Condé Nast, has been published in the New York Times, the Times of London, and the Guardian, which will give you a little bit more of a hint as to where he's from, but his accent will soon give it away. So Mark, thanks so much for coming and agreeing to do this. We're really interested in hearing the topic tonight. And, you know, Mark had decided to talk about the Baha'i principle of the individual investigation of truth. And really, but gave it a wonderful title that's a little bit better than simply the individual investigation of truth. It was searching for truth in a post-factual world. How we can go about as human beings who are all searching for truth, all kinds of truth, how we can go about through that process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and stop talking. You guys are going to think that, oh gosh, Kendall's here to speak again. But luckily you don't have to listen to me. So thanks, Mark, for coming.
Thank you, Kendall. So thank you to Kendall and to Charlotte, our hosts, our Sifter of Dust hosts. And yeah, I'm excited to come and talk about the independent investigation of truth. And I know this is part of a series called the Tea House. And so I'm on brand.
Yes.
I have my tea by me to make sure we're in sync here. So yes, I did give it this provocative title about how to search for truth in a post-factual world, because this Baha'i principle, the independent search for truth, is such a central idea in Baha'i teachings. And in many ways, I think it's more relevant now than ever before, because every day we're assaulted by so much information and misinformation. And you hear of people saying things like, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know where to turn. I don't know who to trust. And that's obviously a huge problem in modern society. So the principle of the independent investigation of truth is really a sort of is a Baha'i principle that offers a solution to that problem. And I think before I dive into the main subject, I just want to give a super quick primer of the Baha'i faith, so it gives a little bit of context to what this principle is that we're going to talk about and why it's important. So Baha'u'llah is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. He revealed his message in 19th century Persia, as it was then, and he really revealed three core principles, broad umbrella principles of the Baha'i faith: that there is one God, that there is one religion, that there are many different expressions of religion throughout the ages, and that there's one humanity. There really is just one human species. It's a biological fact as well. And this idea that this idea of the unity of religions was something that he called progressive revelation, that all the great world religions are really part of one common faith that have been revealed progressively throughout human history, and with messages that are in sync with all the other messengers of God and all the other religions, but are specifically revealed for that time. And so 2000 years ago, we didn't know the world was round. We didn't know anything about a global society. And fast forward to 19th century Persia, Baha'u'llah said, this is a message for unifying the world. And so one God, one religion, and one humanity. And in terms of the oneness of humanity, he talked about many specific principles in great depth about gender equality, racial justice, about eliminating the extremes of wealth and poverty, about the dangers of nationalism, and that pretty much every single problem in society is because of our inability to recognize the oneness of humankind. And so where does this principle of the independent investigation of truth, where does this fit in all of this? So why is the independent investigation of truth considered the first principle of the Baha'i faith? It's repeatedly framed in the Baha'i holy writings as the first principle. I'm not sure if that specifically means it's the most important principle, but maybe a helpful way to think about it is that there are all these teachings of the Baha'i faith, which are these great pillars of the Baha'i faith, and that the foundation is this idea of independently searching for truth. And it sort of underpins every other principle. I wanted to first share a passage by Abdul-Baha, who was the eldest son of Baha'u'llah and was Baha'u'llah's appointed interpreter of the holy writings of Baha'u'llah. And Abdul-Baha gave a talk in Paris in 1911, and this is a passage from that talk. If a man would succeed in his search after truth, he must, in the first place, shut his eyes to all the traditional superstitions of the past. All religions have gradually become bound by tradition and dogma. All consider themselves, respectively, the only guardians of the truth, and that every other religion is composed of errors. They themselves are right, others are wrong. We should therefore detach ourselves from the external forms and practices of religion. We must realize that these forms and practices, however beautiful, are but garments, clothing the warm heart and the living limbs of divine truth. If all condemn one another, where shall we search for the truth? All contradicting one another, all cannot be true. If each believe his particular religion to be the only true one, he blinds his eyes to the truth in others. If 5 people meet together to seek for truth, they must begin by cutting themselves free from all their own special conditions and renouncing all preconceived ideas. In order to find truth, we must give up our prejudices, our own small trivial notions. An open receptive mind is essential. If our chalice is full of self, there is no room in it for the water of life. I'm just going to read that one part again. If our chalice is full of self, there is no room in it for the water of life. The fact that we imagine ourselves to be right and everybody else wrong is the greatest of all obstacles in the path towards unity. And unity is necessary if we would reach truth, for truth is one. And so there's so much to unpack in this. I mean, I could really spend the whole session on just this one quotation, but I want to sort of move quickly through these. There's so much to unpack here. And it's a very interesting idea to me, this idea of freeing ourselves from dogma. And dogma, the dictionary definition of dogma is really sort of this dual meaning. It's any belief that is held with absolute certainty and unquestionable authority, right? Secular, religious, political, whatever that ideology is, whatever that belief system is, if it's held with absolute certainty and unquestionable authority, then that's the kind of thing we're talking about in terms of dogma and our attachment to that. And several things jump out for me with this quotation. I would love to hear in a little bit what others think as well. But this idea that the default notion of belief, and in this case we're talking about religion, the default notion of choosing our religion, the fact that that's based on what part of the world we come from, how we were raised, what kind of school we went to, all of the things that are sort of baked into how we're brought up. That's our default position in terms of how we believe in life, right? It doesn't matter if you're in one part of the world and you're brought up in a Buddhist tradition or a Hindu tradition or in a Christian tradition. We very rarely, humanity historically, think that our natural path is to start exploring beyond that, right? So it takes a lot of individual effort, whether or not what you were brought up with you find to be true or not. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's whether you've done the investigation on whether you feel that is true in your heart. And the Baha'i faith sort of rips up that notion. It turns it completely on its head, that we are born into a religion somehow. The fact that your parents may be Baha'is does not dictate, or at least should not dictate, that you are a Baha'i. If it's just this sort of automated response that, oh, my parents are Baha'is, therefore I should be a Baha'i. I myself was raised in a Baha'i home insofar as my mother was a Baha'i. My mother is a Baha'i, my father wasn't. And so I sort of got to see things with maybe a slightly different perspective in that way. But, Kendall mentioned, in my professional career, I've worked as a journalist and a filmmaker, and for many years I was a travel writer. And I've lived in 7 countries, and I've traveled to many countries, and it's never ceased to amaze me that no matter where you go, people are so often attached to a belief system that they were brought up with, without ever stopping to think why that may be something they believe in, why they would choose to believe in it. I'll always remember traveling with my wife through Morocco, and we had this wonderful driver, a devout Muslim, who we had just so many wonderful conversations with him. And he would, we drove all over Morocco, and he would stop and he would get his prayer mat, his prayer rug out at different times in the day and pray and we would talk about faith and religion. And I remember once we were driving through a deeply orthodox village, a particular denomination of Islam that this village followed. It was they don't call it the burqa, but it was sort of the equivalent of the burqa, the full the full veil from of the body. And our driver Ahmad was describing this village and this traditional way of life, and he says, "You've got to see this traditional village. They all dress in this particular way. All the women wear black and very traditional, and they're very devout." And I said, "So why do they dress this way? What's the particular tradition?" And he said, "Oh, it's their tradition." I said, "I know, but what is it based on? Why do they follow this tradition?" And he was just sort of at a loss and just said, "Well, I don't know. They follow it because it's their tradition." And I've had the same conversations with friends of mine in different parts of the world, and a lovely Italian friend of mine who identifies as a Catholic. But when I asked about why he is a Catholic, he said he had no idea. It's just that's what you're born into. That's part of the deal. So so just before we jump on to the next slide, this other thing that jumps out at me here is this idea of how our own convictions sort of get in the way of our ability to see the truth. And we have such an attachment to our opinions and our views that sometimes that sort of is kind of like a filter for understanding something deeper or something different. It doesn't mean to say that great, I have one view, you have another view. I can't hold on to my view, but this sense that the fact that we don't free ourselves from this sort of prison of prejudice is one of the big stumbling blocks, I feel, for why we're not able to fully independently seek the truth. There's a beautiful book by Baha'i called The Seven Valleys, where it's all about search for truth. And in many different ways, Baha'i says truth is one, that spiritual truth, material truth and reality is one. And if we free ourselves from our attachments to our own preconceived notions, it allows us to remove those filters and investigate with a pure heart. Journey upon these plains in the spirit of search, not in blind imitation. And Abdul Baha, his son, writes, blind imitation of the past will stunt the mind, but once every soul inquireth into truth, society will be freed from the darkness of continually repeating the past. There's a very sort of complete picture in Baha'i teachings about what searching for truth means. And this book, The Seven Valleys, is this deeply mystical book of really sort of the journey of the soul in terms of trying to understand the nature of the soul and our place in the world. And at the same time, Baha'u'llah talks about the soul as being the rational soul, which is incredible, because it's not just our capacity to understand the divine and the mystical, but our human capacity of reason and rationale, and they're not separate. It's the rational soul, which is such a beautiful way of putting it, that it is the intellect and our spiritual sense as one. And this passage I'm about to read speaks to that. God has created in man the power of reason, whereby man is enabled to investigate reality. God has not intended man to imitate blindly his fathers and ancestors. He has endowed him with mind, or the faculty of reasoning, by the exercise of which he is to investigate and discover the truth, and that which he finds real and true he must accept. He must not be an imitator or blind follower of any soul. He must not rely implicitly upon the opinion of any man without investigation. Sorry, let me read that again. He must not rely implicitly upon the opinion of any man without investigation. Nay, each soul must seek intelligently and independently, arriving at a real conclusion and bound only by that reality. The greatest cause of bereavement and disheartening in the world of humanity is ignorance, based upon blind imitation. It is due to this that wars and battles prevail. From this cause, hatred and animosity arise continually among mankind. And so this idea that we have a rational soul, on the one hand, it may not sound like such a big headline, right? Yes, of course, we're rational beings, but we live, especially now, in a society with a lot of emotion in the legacy media and in social media, it's just white noise turned up to 11. People's emotion and response and outrage and this idea that we can strip ourselves from all of that and actually independently investigate things and use our rational minds is central to Baha'i teaching in a couple of specific ways that come to mind. The first is that, we were talking about dogma, that the last part of this passage, dogma doesn't always have to be religious, right? So, the dogma of nationalism is something, again, I found this all over the world, not just in this country. People are really, really attached to their countries in a way which is distinct from maybe what you could call legitimate patriotism, where you have a deep love and connection from the place where you come from, which is distinct from the implicit or explicit idea that my country is better than yours. And I love this passage that we just looked at, because it's this idea to me that we have been, for millennia, for centuries, I guess I should say, in terms of nationhood, attached to this idea that our nation is better than your nation. And it's a kind of a dogma, just in the same way as my opinion is better than your opinion. This attachment to our own, the importance of our own place in the world. And that if we free ourselves from that, it allows us to venture forth and really investigate. There are a couple of interconnected principles in the Baha'i faith, which speak to this sense of independent thought. The first is that, as far as I understand, the Baha'i faith is the first religion in history to have a body of work, which are the holy writings, or scripture, or however you want to call it. Baha'is normally just say the writings, and which is written down by the prophet founder, the messenger of God himself. So Baha'u'llah wrote in his own hand hundreds of volumes, books, letters that are authenticated texts. And so one of the immensely exciting things for me about being a Baha'i is that we can go to the written word, which Baha'is consider to be the word of God. And in the same way that followers of religions turn to their scriptures, Baha'is turn to our scriptures. The difference being is there is no intermediary, right? So there's the individual and the written word, and these are first-hand writings. Historically, before, it would be something reported or word of mouth written down many years later, which of course has led to a lot of conflict and interpretation about, well, what was said, what is the actual teaching, all the different divisions and sects of and interpretations of a particular religion. There's one Baha'i faith, and it's just wonderful that you can, this phrase in the Bible, by their fruits ye shall know them, right? And so the in other words, if a prophet is real, if a manifestation of God, if a messenger of God is real, and by the holy writings of the Baha'i faith, you can read them and explore them and investigate them for yourself. And you can accept them or refute them. But there's no equivocation about what those teachings are, because they're all written down. And hand in hand with that principle is the fact that there's no clergy in the Baha'i faith, that there's no sense of religious hierarchy. In centuries past, there would have been a need for, and understandably so, for a priesthood where the vast masses were illiterate, that pretty much the only people who could read and write were the people at the pulpit. And so the Baha'i faith does away with with a clergy. Instead, in fact, there is an administrative system of local and also national councils, which are democratically elected. And I mean democratically elected in sort of the completely opposite way of how we understand democratic elections in this country. It's a silent, prayerful process. There's no electioneering, there's no campaigning. To serve on what is called a local or national spiritual assembly is considered an act of service. And those local assemblies are there to guide and organize the affairs of a community. But they're not there to tell you what to believe, how to believe in this particular way, how to interpret it. It's between you and the written word. And so as someone who's spent, I spent my entire professional career as a journalist and also more recently as a filmmaker, I love that idea that there's an original source, that if you want to know what this is, you can go to the source, right? It's just between you and the source. This leads me to the only image I have in the slides, which is a source of water. So there you go. I threw in an image just to change things up a little bit. There is this wonderful passage by a Baha'i writer called Bahiya Naqshbandi. And she has an entire book called Asking Questions. And when we think of blind imitation and just following the traditions and in many cases the dogmas of what we were taught to believe or what was just sort of what we grew up with, you have to think of, well, what's the opposite of dogma, right? What is the opposite of that definition of a belief with unquestionable authority and absolute certainty? The opposite of that is asking questions, and asking questions is explicitly encouraged and embraced in Baha'i thinking. And I'm just going to read this passage. It is, I'm sorry, I actually wrote that out wrong on the spell check. It must have changed. It is tempting, not attempting. It is tempting to assume that the Baha'i faith is offering us answers, when in fact what it is doing is helping us to pose the correct questions. We naively perceive questions as doubt and answers as certitude, and assume rather glibly that just by being Baha'is, we have all the longed for answers to the imponderable questions of our age. And this really speaks to me as a journalist and as a Baha'i, because it impels us to constantly think of the why in our lives. As a young journalist, I was sort of told, okay, here's what you need to ask, right? It's like what, when, where, how, and why. And that most important question is the why. Why do we believe what we believe? And to constantly question, everything, but to question in the right way with a spirit of inquiry and trying to understand the truth, not in terms of just sort of blind, provocative questions for the sake of questioning. And especially asking questions of ourselves, and asking questions of ourselves is the most uncomfortable part, but it's central to being a Baha'i. There's also, I should also just mention that there's a Baha'i calendar of 19 months, and each of these months are named after an attribute of God: honor, mercy, knowledge. There's a Baha'i month named questions, which tells you how important questions are in the Baha'i faith. I'm gonna probably skip a couple of sections because otherwise it may sort of run a bit too long here. But the idea of investigating reality in the Baha'i perspective embraces science. Baha'u'llah talks about science and religion as being two wings of a bird, that the bird can only fly if those two wings are equally balanced. Science is really just another way of of understanding truth and understanding reality. And to sort of hop back to that earlier quote, this idea that truth is one, right? There are different ways of getting to that, to a single truth. And science is just another way of approaching truth. But truth is still one. And one of the things that comes to mind as an example for me is climate science, right? We're at a point now where there's such an overwhelming body of scientific evidence that human behavior has caused the Earth's atmosphere to warm, and that is a matter of scientific consensus. But it's also a spiritual truth, right? That our behavior has consequences, and that we are all members of one human family throughout the world, and our actions in one part of the planet can affect other people in another part of the planet, and that we all suffer from the effects of climate change. And so whether you're led to that single truth through a spiritual or moral perspective or through a scientific perspective, it's the same truth. This quote from Abdul Baha'i is, "In fact, science may be likened to a mirror wherein the infinite forms and images of existing things are revealed and reflected. Without this basis of investigation, development is impossible. Therefore, seek with diligent endeavor the knowledge and attainment of all that lies within the power of this wonderful bestowal." Sorry, there's this one other quote on science that I really love that I want to read. "Religion must stand the analysis of reason. It must agree with scientific fact and proof, so that science will sanction religion and religion will fortify science. Both are indissolubly welded and joined in reality. If statements and teachings of religion are found to be unreasonable and contrary to science, they are outcomes of superstition and imagination." I want to wrap up with a story here, which again is from the Seven Valleys. "Knowledge is a single point, but the ignorant have multiplied it." Which is in fact Baha'u'llah quoting from a hadith from Islamic writings, that he quotes this in the Seven Valleys, and it's this same idea that that if we searched in a spirit of detaching ourselves from our own, the attachment of our own convictions, we get to see something in its pure sense. And the story that comes to mind when I was reading this is there's a 13th century Persian poet called Rumi, and he wrote a poem called "The Elephant in the Dark," which in fact was his own version of a story that goes back to Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and it's been told and retold in various ways. And in this poem, there's this guy who brings an elephant back to the village in the thick of night, and all the villagers get wind of this. There's this mysterious creature that this guy's brought back, and it's in the night, and he brings the elephant into the barn, and all the villagers are getting more and more curious, and they want to know what is this creature. And so one of them sort of hops in the dark in the barn. He feels his way around the elephant, and he finds he feels the tusk, and so he comes out and he says, it's a sword-like creature. And so one of the other villagers jumps into the barn, and he feels that the sort of the big flapping ear of the elephant, and says, no, it's a fan. It's some sort of fan kind of creature. Someone else hops in, feels one of the legs. No, it's the thick pillars of a temple. You're all wrong. Someone else jumps in, feels the trunk of the elephant. No, it's actually a hose. It's some sort of creature with this hose, and the villagers start fighting about what the truth is, like what this creature actually is. And at least in one telling of the story, because there are different translations of the Rumi poem, the villagers then creep back into the barn, all with candles, so all together collectively actually seeing in the light that it is indeed an elephant, and that they were so attached to their own truth, their own way of looking at it. They couldn't see the bigger picture. And it's sort of a beautiful parable about how truth is one, that if they had maybe possibly understood that, okay, here's what I have, what do you have, can we piece it together, they may have gotten there quicker. But it required the light of the whole for them to approach that together, and for them to detach themselves from their own convictions, and that there is a multiplicity of ways to reach the truth, even though there is one truth, that creature is an elephant and nothing else. And so that was sort of an interesting parable to me about how we approach truth and how we investigate, and how we can kind of get there in the end. I'm going to wrap up so that we have some time for questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mark. I know I really personally enjoyed hearing your presentation on the independent investigation of truth and how important it is. I know it was the most important principle for me when I was investigating the Baha'i faith. And I love that, you were talking about how we don't have to just blindly follow what we've been taught, that, we're all individuals, we all are our own person, and that we all have our own brains and our own beliefs and our own soul. And we have to investigate what we believe truth to be. And I think in the society we live in today, we have to be conscious consumers, right? Like, what is this item I'm buying in the grocery store? I need to know what these ingredients are, because I don't know what those are. We have to consciously educate ourselves on what we're eating and all kinds of things. And I think people don't often stop and think about their faith, because it's just passed down, and that's what people are used to doing. They just accept what their parents believed. And I love this. And I did want to ask you, if people are listening and they're wondering, okay, so how do you independently investigate this truth? You mentioned there's a source, the writings is the word of God, and that's probably the best. But could you give any other practical advice on how else to independently investigate, please?
Yeah. So connected to that idea that we don't have a clergy, it's also worth saying that these are just my personal interpretations. There are no intermediaries for the Baha'i faith to say this is how you should do something, or this is what the Baha'i faith is. It's really my understanding. But married to that, and my professional life as a journalist, this idea of the scientific method of investigating something, and this idea of the rational soul, is absolutely paramount to how we investigate reality and how we investigate the truth. And so everything we look at should be evidence-based, right? Just again, by their fruits ye shall know them. Okay, so in terms of the investigating the Baha'i faith, you can read those writings for yourself, and even maybe I'm not sure if this goes up on YouTube as well as a podcast, but I can happily put some sources and maybe a couple of recommendations in terms of places to start. But you can decide, is Baha'u'llah's claims kind of nice and interesting, and that sounds kind of wonderful, but seriously, he must be crazy. Or is he who he says he is? Is he a messenger of God? So like anything, go to the source, look at evidence-based, look at multiple sources. And that's the same for anything in reality. The idea that that you would accept something without confirming its factual basis is when things get dangerous. And I think that's unfortunately true for a lot of people in terms of how they consume news media as well as social media. It's just why stop to think about whether this is true? I heard it from this source that I go to. Well, does this source have an agenda? Have you checked other sources? Is it someone talking about someone else doing something or saying something? Have you gone to like, have you actually listened or read that for yourself? And also this idea of being open to being wrong is kind of paramount. I think that one of my favorite writers and podcasters, Malcolm Gladwell, yeah, he always talks about this. He has this insistence of his right to be wrong and to revise what he thought previously. And he's talked about his breakout book. I can't remember if it was Blink or the other one, but he's revised his opinion about other certain things that he became actually famous for writing. And so this idea that we are continually asking questions means, it's, the title of my talk was about searching for the truth, not finding the truth. The moment we come to a rest point where we feel done, found it, I'm good, is the moment we stop asking questions, which is the moment we stop learning. And that's sort of the kiss of death. So to continually ask questions of ourselves, and the most uncomfortable questions of ourselves, to go to multiple sources, to reconfirm a factual basis for that information. Those are the kind of things that come to mind.
One of the most impressive things for me when I was studying the faith was the statements of Baha'u'llah, of course, that he's claiming to be bearing a revelation from God, which is really in some ways the essence of truth. But then he was telling us to free our minds, to look into all things with a searching eye. That was a line from his writings. He was really encouraging us to use our souls and our minds and detach ourselves from our historical loves and hates, to try and look at this reality with a fresh perspective. People who are trying to fool you don't do that, right? They don't invite you to use your own mind and to look at, they're not transparent about it. Baha'u'llah was so transparent throughout his life with everything. He said, come read my writings, read the tablets. And that is always very impressive to me, and still has remained so. And I think is a major factor that impresses me more about Baha'u'llah's claim.
Yeah, Sean has a question. Sean, I'm going to unmute you.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. I had to go away to check on my son a little bit, so I hope this question wasn't already asked. But like when you gave the definition of dogma, Mark, I kind of immediately thought like, well, I'd have to say that there are some beliefs of mine that come pretty close to that definition, right? Like, or at least, the concept of a revelation, right? Like if I'm a Baha'i, I believe like this is the word of God, right? So like if I call myself a Baha'i, like I have a fairly high level of certainty that this is the truth. Like take for instance the idea, like central principle of the Baha'i faith is like the idea that it's possible to have a united like global society, right? And that's ideal. That's like that's what we're heading towards. That's something I personally believe that like rationally makes sense to me, but it also has this layer like that is if I'm a Baha'i, I believe that's like the revealed word of God, right? And I think if I'm being perfectly honest, that is going to influence the way I interact with other people, right? Like to go to Abdu'l Baha's example of like 5 people like getting together and having a conversation, right? Like if I was having a conversation with like somebody else, and their idea was, actually was sort of contrary to that. It was something like, I don't think human beings were ever meant to live in communities above 30 people. Like, we're just tribal in nature, and that's just how we do best. Like, I, I I think I would, to participate in that conversation in good faith, I would probably have to say, like, hey, like, my religion, this is a core tenet that we believe. It's it's sort of like the destiny of humanity. It's like the God ordained destiny of humanity to be living in a global society, right? So, like, I think as Baha'is, as a Baha'i, I feel like I have some blind spots as well, and I think just religion in general, it's often it's often hard to say, like, if we're always arriving at our positions by like a rational process of investigation. I mean, because certainly a lot of it we arrive at because we believe the prophet is who they say they are, and we're accepting like what they've said. So it just seems like a sort of a fundamental like tension there.
Yes, yeah, no, that's wonderful, Sean. The one of the key things I think is how you get to that position. Hopefully I didn't suggest that the sort of the jumping off point then is that, oh, you shouldn't really have any convictions. I mean, of course we all have our own beliefs, but I think something that's helpful is when I was thinking about and reflecting about this subject in more depth, there was a passage from a volume of Baha'u'llah's called The Hidden Words, which I know you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. And this idea that justice and independent investigation of the truth are wed together is so interesting to me. So the fact that the position that you were talking about, for example, with believing in a global society and the interconnectedness of all human beings. First, the fact that you got to that position by thinking about it for yourself and not just blindly accepting it because, oh, you were told this is just how you should believe, is the first step. But also, and if I may, I'm gonna read out this quote that I had in mind from The Hidden Words of Baha'u'llah. It's called, "The best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor." And so the idea of I guess sort of the purity of motive. If your idea in terms of understanding the world and presenting and expressing your understanding of the world and your Baha'i perspective is to sort of metaphorically bludgeon someone over the head to get them to believe this because you feel this is right, then that sort of that way into that conversation and that way into understanding that conversation is stunted, because even with the conviction that you have, which I share, of living in a global society, it doesn't mean to say that we may not learn from other people that have a diametrically opposed opinion, and that may help inform what we believe. It's not about necessarily having a conversation with someone and changing what we believe. It's just about being less attached to it in a way where you feel, because the attachment it works in a couple of ways. It's like, this is what I believe, no one's going to change what I believe, but that attachment with wanting to make sure that the other person gets what you get and that they accept what you believe in is something we all need to maybe sort of back away from. And I think as Baha'is, we generally possibly back away from that sort of more than most, because of this principle that we don't proselytize, right? So the idea of proselytization is forbidden in the Baha'i faith, and so sometimes we tread a bit too carefully, sort of come at it from a different way. Sometimes we tread a bit too delicately about who we are as Baha'is and our place in the world. But yeah, it's an interesting paradox to be able to reconcile those two things, Sean.
One of the things, I was going to say, Sean, I'm glad Sean brought this point up. Going back to that issue of dogma, I think dogma I would think of it more as truths you accept upon which you have not reflected on. They're things you accept blindly. I always had connected those two together. But one of the other things I wanted to say about the writings that has struck me is there are times, and some of my favorite passages, and they're very subtle, are when Baha'u'llah will be asked a question. He said, well, you could look at it this way, or you could look at it that way. It sort of depends on how you look at it. And I love that aspect of the faith, that reality has shades. It has texture. It has different aspects. For your example, Sean, of the Baha'is are focused on the emphasis on world civilization. A friend might come to you and say, well, I'm an American. Don't I have a right to worry about my people? Or I'm let's say a country in the world that has historically not been as materially blessed, maybe an African country, for instance. You might say, well, my mission in life is to make sure that the Gambia becomes the strongest possible country. And that's what I want to do. I want to focus on my people and I want to see them develop. But there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine, right? They're not being overly nationalistic by doing that. So it doesn't mean they're not participating in this concept of a global civilization. I think there's a balance there where when you hear other people's opinions, they may have an alternate opinion, but it's often simply a matter of shading and spectrum rather than it depends on where you happen to be putting the emphasis at that particular moment. If somebody says, I'm going to be on my country and we're going to dominate the world and we're going to take over the world, well, that's different than if somebody says, I want to devote to my people and bringing up my people, which is a truly noble act. So that's what I mean. I think that there are shades of truth in every conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And I think that what you mentioned, Kendall, also speaks to this Baha'i principle of consultation, which is which could be a subject of a whole other talk. But this idea that how we solve problems, and we talked about these local or national spiritual assemblies, these local councils where sometimes you've got to discuss a lot of really seemingly intractable issues, and it requires frank and loving conversation where the goal is to as a body of people unify and solve a problem. And again, that can't happen if you're attached to your own opinion, but there's a relationship, right? Or sort of there's that part of it, but there's also this other part of it that I guess you mentioned, Kendall, which is the nuance and shade. And in the Baha'i writings, it talks about how the clash, the spark of truth comes from the clash of differing opinions. And so to have different opinions is a wonderful thing, right? Who wants to spend their entire lives just sitting around nodding to someone else? You want to be able to understand life and reality, and you want your understanding of the world in no matter what we're talking about to be challenged, right? And so again, it goes back to asking questions, and those conversations that you have with people hopefully sparks questions in yourself to look at things in new ways.
Mhm.
I always think of, there's this Bob Dylan quote, not from a song. There was I had this collection of Bob Dylan interviews, and he was backstage at Madison Square Garden, and halfway through the interview, a publicist sort of interrupts and starts talking to him, and so the interviewer is just sort of waiting sort of patiently, and she says, "Oh, by the way, how's it going?" And he says, "Not very well." She goes, "What's the problem?" He goes, "He keeps asking questions." And people don't like questions. We don't like questions that challenge. Well, questions by nature challenge the pre-assumed position of something. And questions are the most healthy thing in the world. It's how we learn.
One of the wonderful things I think to do is, and I did this a few years back, and I was very enriched by it, was to read how Baha'u'llah tells us to talk about the faith with others. And he talks about sharing it in a spirit of extreme kindliness, as if, but not esteeming yourself, not thinking of yourself in any way as being greater. And I think that one of the terms that helps me for is this idea of revelation. This idea of reveal. What to reveal something is to bring it out into the open, to make it more obvious. It doesn't mean it's not there, and it doesn't mean that other people can't recognize it. I mean, I think the truths of Baha'u'llah are the truths that everyone is coming to recognize. And so to Sean's point, I have been humbled really, I think over the years by looking at science, for instance. Science operates, the medical community operates in a very, in a way that is very consistent with the Baha'i teachings. Ideas are shared in a global information system that we call Medline, through publication in journals. They're discussed, they're commented on, there's an active discussion that occurs back and forth, often very professional, very civil, very friendly. And, gradually we move this body of science forward. It's really a wonderful example of what Baha'is talk about when we talk about consultation. It's almost the exact same thing, or if not is the exact same thing. So, I think that I think taking that a humble approach that Baha'u'llah really tells us to do is to take that humble approach. Just to say one more point, in the time of Baha'u'llah, there were the Western societies were producing a lot of goods, the industrial machinery and so forth. They were really and flooding the Eastern countries that has historically been the dominant countries. The Middle East was the dominant for centuries. And then beginning in about the 1700s, it began to shift. And so there was a great deal of prejudice in the Eastern countries against these Western arts, what were referred to as the Western arts and sciences in the writings. And Baha'u'llah says in a beautiful passage, he says these arts and sciences should be seen as a reflection of God, really. Progress is a reflection of God. We should cherish them. And so that sort of open-hearted perspective to recognize that, and as Baha'u'llah also says, all things are of God. That we don't have we don't have pat answers. There aren't easy answers to many of the questions that we face. And taking that humble approach, I think, is extremely important and also true and reality. But it also does not mean that we don't have something very significant to share that is very meaningful to the world. In fact, I think what we find in the Baha'i writings are the principles by which we can come together as a global community, build peace, but they're principles that we then need to figure out how to put in action. Some communities are even better at certain principles than we are, because we're all learning. And that's fine. It's not just the Baha'i faith is not for Baha'is, it's for the whole world. I mean, Baha'u'llah's revelation was really, he talks about it permeating the essence of all things, right? It's what's in the water. It's the rhythm that drives the beat of creation. And I think that, understanding of that in that global way helps us to not be in any way feel ourselves in any way superior.
Friends, sorry, just in the interest of time, I did want to just move on to Catherine. Catherine, you had a question. Sorry about that. Oh, sorry, Catherine, let me just unmute you. Okay.
Yeah, hi. I think it has been addressed. I just wanted to give the example of I used to have Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists and people like that come to my door. And I really don't know a lot about those faiths. So I would very enthusiastically invite them in, and we would have wonderful conversations because I wanted to know about them and where they were. And it was interesting because they wanted to come back. But the next time they asked me about me. And, I tell them a little bit about the faith. And if there was a third time that they would come back, it would be with an older person, or they just wouldn't come back again. But nevertheless, it was, there's so much that we can learn. For example, there's a philosophy based on a book called A Course in Miracles, which has helped me to deepen my faith. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Baha'i faith, but it has helped me to deepen my understanding of what it is to be Baha'i. So I think everything was already addressed. That was just going to be my comment about getting curious and not losing that curiosity about others, because we're all in this together. None of us makes it to the final place without everybody else. We're in this together. That's just my own comment.
Lovely comment.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Catherine.
Yes, thank you. Betsy, you have a question. I'm going to unmute you. Okay. And then if you can unmute yourself, Betsy, once.
Hi. So just Catherine, I totally support with what you said. Since I moved down here, I am no longer, and I'm living in an apartment building, I'm no longer greeted by Mormons and witnesses, et cetera, at the door. And, interesting conversations when I was living up in Vermont. And one of my favorite opportunities was I think it was the day before Easter. One year, there's a very evangelical Christian minister with his flock in town in Bennington, and he and his comrade were coming, and they were giving out videos on the life of Jesus or something like that. And we knew each other, so it wasn't a cold contact. I think he was surprised, but I certainly knew each other, so it wasn't cold, a cold contact, as in nobody knew each other. Anyway, he was just surprised when I opened the door, I'm sure. Anyhow, I said, I would love to have a video on the life of Christ. Would you take, and there was some Baha'i video we had at the time, would you take take a Baha'i video on Baha'u'llah? And he said, yeah. And then he started to talk about Baha'u'llah, and we had to practice how to say that word and that name. And it was a charming and sweet and really funny having the evangelical minister practicing saying Baha'u'llah, 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 and to get it straight on our front porch. But that's not what I called to. Anyway, they're great encounters. Sean, I wanted to respond to this wonderful subject that you brought up, and I think that that it's possible to talk to everybody like they're not with the assumption that they're knowledgeable and intelligent, and I think that sounds like what you're doing, and just be. We're not going to, slap them upside the head with the faith or anything like that, but to that I think that it feels to me that so much in the recent decade or two has been dumbed down. It just feels like that there's a real dumbing down, and I could be really wrong on that. And I think that people enjoy a loving, kind challenge on whatever the subject is, the piece of the about the faith that would come up organically in a conversation. And I think it's kind of welcomed. It's because it's always it's a refreshing point of view. And I think that generally people enjoy being spoken to in a new way, and that makes an assumption of their intelligence and their curiosity and their sense of inquiry, and that. And sometimes there are holes that you have to fill in, and but I think that builds a real nice bridge. And the person's not necessarily going to become a Baha'i or embrace it, or the conversation might not go anywhere else. But I think just having that respect for the other's intelligence is really important.
If I could just jump in for a second, I know we're looking to wrap things up. Something I was thinking about just in this sort of latter part of the conversation was the spirit in which we have conversations with people. And I sort of think of when, if any of you have learned another language, it's like when you learn another language, your goal is to learn this other language, but you learn so much more about your own language and about how it's constructed and things you'd never even stop to think about. Oh, okay, so that's the structure of how we put a sentence together, but we don't have a verb for this, but then and it's the same kind of thing here, right? The idea that we are the guardians of the truth and we are going to enlighten you with this conversation. No, it's this idea that if we go into every conversation with the spirit of wanting to learn something, because by definition, sharing something and teaching something is also a process of learning, then I think that's the sort of the gift we can try to explore. It's not that we're going to even want to necessarily convert someone or bring someone around to our perspective, that we're going to share something and that we're going to learn something in the process.
I think that there's, I'm a Baha'i, obviously, and I believe that there is, to your point, Mark, I'm trying to make a point that's dovetails on yours. I believe that this is how God speaks to humanity through these great religions that bring these beautiful and majestic messages, which are so sublime and significant into the world. But then they get passed human to human. They don't happen in some sort of, they don't show up on CNN. They don't get pushed out by the big corporations to try and infiltrate into our lives, right? They get passed heart to heart in this sort of authentic way. And that's intentional, right? That's intentional because the process of us sharing, being reflective about it, like we're having these discussions tonight, and then doing it in a way that it helps us grow, right? We grow more than anything in the whole process, right? So, I keep going back to the writings of Baha'u'llah, but there's this wonderful passage where he says, if God wanted, he would cause the lion of indomitable dominion to come and be manifest in the world and would basically, make everybody a certain way. But he doesn't want that, right? He wants people to find themselves and then go through a process of sharing things with others so that everybody's going on a process of learning. The whole purpose is to learn. I just wanted to make that point, Mark. I think that's a really critical idea, that it's sort of been designed this way. Religion's been designed this way, to share heart to heart with a humble spirit. That's the way it's supposed to be done. So. Well, thank you all. Charlotte, are you still there?
I'm still here. And yes, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And Mark, thank you so much. I think I'm just so feel very blessed that you could join us this evening and
Oh,
share
thank you, Charlotte.
your knowledge and your insights and your love and your wisdom. And thanks for everybody for joining, because everybody's discussions and questions really make this so fruitful and insightful. And I hope we all learned something this evening.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And in 2 weeks, we have, as I said, Karen Ashragi. She'll be joining us to talk about consultation, which is just another one of my favorite principles. So please do join us for that one too.
Wonderful.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Everybody.
evening.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Mark. Thanks.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.